Welcome to Healing America with Dr. Jim White. Jim has been investing, coaching executives, and turning around companies for over 30 years. Now your host, Dr. Jim White.
Hi, and welcome to Healing America. This evening, we're honored to have Pulitzer Prize winner for history, Jack Norman Rakove. It's such a pleasure to have him on the show tonight. And when I was researching Broken America, I actually researched a lot of his material on the Constitution. So it is a real pleasure to have him with us this evening to talk about the Constitution and some of the political events that's occurring today. And Jack is an American historian and author and professor at Stanford University. Jack, thank you and welcome to the show.
Happy to be here.
Thank you. Let's jump right into your book, Original Meanings. And in your book, and just perusing, it outlines the conditions of deliberation that led to the adoption of the Constitution. What were some of those deliberations that occurred at that time?
Well, there's a whole course of deliberations, which if you describe them as a historian, you always have to have your chronology straight. You probably want to go back to the early 1780s, the Articles of Confederation, which were our first national constitution. It had been framed in the mid-1770s, weren't ratified until 1781. As soon as they were ratified, the different proposals to amend them in modest ways were made. None of those proposals succeeded. The basic problem was that to amend the articles, you needed the consent of all 13 state legislatures. That proved impossible to obtain. So you have a kind of period in the sometimes called the critical years, in the right after the Revolutionary War ends, where there are different efforts afoot to figure out how do you strengthen, rather somewhat modestly, the national government under the Articles, which is essentially a single chamber kind of Congress. Mm-hmm. And there comes a point in 1786 after several of these efforts there's one effort made in 1781, another in 1783, another 1786 to get some amendments, considered and adopted. After all those fail, James Madison, with some of his existence of Alexander Hamilton and John Dickinson, a couple other notable revolutionary leaders, in effect go for broke. I mean, having run out of options to amend the Articles in the way that was prescribed by the Confederation itself, they kind of went, outside the box, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And they came up with the idea of let's hold a general convention held under the authority of the state legislatures with the approval of the Continental Congress, and let's see what happens. Mm-hmm. I think they did it. They didn't do it out of excessive optimism. I think they really think they felt they were running out of options. But if they didn't do something dramatic, they worried, with good reason, that the whole Confederation might devolve into two or three regional confederacies.
If the framework of the Constitution was deliberated, how different do you think the Constitution would look, or would it be the same?
It's such an open-ended question. A lot of people have started to agonize about it. I've thought about this occasion. I've thought about actually writing a book about it. We don't really know. Yeah. The Senate drafted a bill some years ago, which would have laid out rules for how the convention would deliberate, such a convention would deliberate. There are proposals afoot. There's one afoot now to have what's called a limited constitutional convention that would take up a single, budget. I think the optimal amendment would be a balanced budget amendment. Mm-hmm. The problem with that idea is it's an open question. Could you have a limited convention? On the basis of 1787, in effect, what the Constitutional Convention did was to more or less tear up its nominal instructions and say, we're going to really think things over from scratch. I mean, in theory, they're supposed to propose amendments to the Confederation, to the existing charter, but in practice, they said, we're not going to do that. We're going to kind of, take up the whole issue, in effect, de novo, afresh. So people worry, I think, legitimately that if we had a convention today, the idea you might claim to convene it as having a limited agenda. Whether you could enforce that, that's an open question. Here's another question that agitated James Madison a lot. What would the rules of voting be in a Constitutional Convention? There's a big debate took place just when the Virginians and the Pennsylvanians, the first two delegations to be present, were there. They wanted to debate, should we move against the idea of an equal state vote, which was the rule of voting for the Continental Congress, where every state, regardless of size, had the same vote. The large states all favored we have to move to some sort of proportional representation, proportion to population and or wealth. And the question was, what should the rule of voting be within the convention? And the Pennsylvanians said, we should have proportionality from the start. Madison said, no, let's not do it from the start because that will really alarm the small state delegates. We have to convince them of it as we're going on. So all these questions are open. But we reached a moment in our history where there's so many questions are coming up. I mean, not just around the Trump presidency, which is disastrous enough in its own right and is called into question virtually every constitutional norm we're attached to. There's so many questions at play that you can imagine in so many structural things that a lot of people think we need to deal with. But how you do it remains a great challenge, which is what makes the experience in 1787 and 88 so interesting. The way they solved the problem, if you're a historian like me, remains a fascinating story.
It is fascinating. And I must ask you, have you seen the musical Hamilton?
We did. Actually, we saw it in Chicago 2 years ago. I was there to give a Constitution Day talk at my dad's old campus. My dad was a college professor, taught about Chicago politics. So I gave a talk at University of Illinois in Chicago, where he taught for a long time. And then we saw Hamilton on that same visit. Yeah.
My wife it took me to my 70th birthday. That was my gift for my 70th birthday, is to watch that. I found it fascinating.
That's a great idea. Yeah, well, historians love it. I mean, I don't like the treatment of Madison and Jefferson. I'm essentially a Madison guy, but it's the way in which it's awakened people's interest, and also, of course, the whole staging of it.
Yeah, you're right.
Multicultural American event. It's so dramatic and so so engaging. It's hard not to love it.
Yeah, I love storytelling in that history. And you are an expert on James Madison. So what kind of political skills did Madison bring to bear that enabled him to become the so-called father of the Constitution? What were those skills that he had?
Well, it's a combination of things. I mean, I think it matters that Madison found his vocation in politics. The 18th century politics was not really a profession, particularly in America. There's in any institution you look at, there'd be a lot of turnover, a lot of rotation. The whole idea you'd make a career out of it in the way the modern politicians do. I mean, of all the differences between our political system and theirs, I think the biggest one is the desire of politicians today to seek re-election. Until they drop in their tracks, on the way out. But Madison was one of the, sometimes called the young men of the Revolution, who discovered that his real vocation was to be a politician, and I think also to be a deliberator. Madison's, his first really 27 years in politics were all spent in deliberative bodies, meaning the Virginia legislature, Virginia Council of State, an advisory body, the Continental Congress, the Virginia Assembly again, the first federal Congress, or the first 4 federal Congresses under the Constitution. So Madison thought a lot about the nature of deliberation, and I think he had a capacity to generalize on the basis of his experience, and to be in a sense self-reflective about what he had been doing. And so he had, one of my university professors at Harvard, when I did my graduate work, Judith Sklar, has a remarkable passage about Madison's capacity to think historically, and I think that's true. I mean, Madison was trying. It's a book I published recently called "A Politician Thinking." Came out a few years ago on Madison. It was meant to try to capture the way in which he was. It wasn't just that he was well read, which he was, and he was educated at the College of New Jersey, which of course is now Princeton University, under the tutelage of John Witherspoon, very leading, who was the college's president. So Madison was well read in the same way that John Adams was well read, Thomas Jefferson was well read, Hamilton was well read. These guys had serious minds; they're serious readers in a way that we would expect few contemporary politicians to be. But Madison was also a creative political thinker, and when it gets down to 1786, 1787, and he starts to prepare for the convention. I've worked on these documents time and again in my career. He goes through a kind of systematic analysis of what he called the vices of the political system in the United States. I'm thinking of actually writing a modern variation on this, going back to what we were saying. No, seriously, we said half seriously. about this. And it's really, it's the basis for what became many of the famous arguments he made in the Federalist, some months later. But he tried to pull his thoughts together on the eve of the convention. Really in March, April 1787, the convention met. It was supposed to meet in mid-May. Kind of finally got its quorum together in late May. So you can see actually the rudiments, well, more than the roots. You can see the essential components of Madison's constitutional theory, which we still study today, what we call the Madisonian Constitution. You see how he's pulling them together. He did it really to prepare his agenda. I mean, I think because he'd spent so much time in deliberative bodies, and because he was so thoughtful about so reflective about the experience, I think Madison understood that while you couldn't always, can't always get what you want, you couldn't always attain every objective you had. But if you were well prepared for debate, if you had thought the agenda through ex ante before your lazier colleagues were putting their mind to it, you would gain certain advantages. So Madison, I think, was almost always the best, maybe not universally, but almost always the best prepared participant in any given debate.
And if I ask, the politician from Madison, what skills have you seen in these politicians that has Madison skills?
I didn't quite get that, Jim. You have to, sorry.
The question is, in which politicians have you seen some of those skills in the decades since Madison that had those skills?
That's a great question. I don't know. We're so, we as a people, and myself as a scholar, we're so hung up on the founders that it's hard to make great comparisons. Many of the politicians I've met, I've really come to admire. I mean, I think the ones who are best, congressmen, you realize when you have a chance to talk to them, they know their issue, they know the issues they care about so well. I mean, I think there are ways in which, for example, the congressional committee system often works and I think members pick their own issues. Some of it depending on what constituency they come from, but also depending on which issues do they actually care most about. So I think among a fair number of politicians who are who are conscientious, that desire to master the subject is a skill that's worth having. And on the rare occasions I've had some occasions I've had a chat with them that often comes out. But what I do think is fundamentally different, point I alluded to earlier, is that from Madison's perspective, Madison hoped that in a period when, most members of any legislative body would typically serve a term, maybe 2 or 3 terms, but, then go off and do something else. And nobody could imagine back in the 18th century that you'd want to spend, a life cycle going back and forth from Washington or the national capital, originally New York, then Philadelphia, then finally Washington. Don't imagine you want to go back and forth indefinitely, from your home plantation, your home office, whatever, your home farm to Washington. I mean, it'd be, to use an old 18th century expression, it'd be quite a schlep to have to do that.
Yeah.
So I think Madison hoped that over time you would develop, kind of sense, more of a sense of vocation, that more and more politicians would grow to be more inclined. But, the fact is, if you look at the federal Congress, the mean term of service in the House of Representatives for the first century, down to the 1890s, was 3 years, meaning the vast number of members of the House were serving 1 or 2 terms. Very few senators served 2 terms. What's happened since the turn of the 20th century, and now has become such a critical fact, is members really want to die in office. They can't figure out how to move up. They want to hold on to the office they have, and I think that ambition. I mean, I think it's worse in the Republican Party. I mean, I think it's true throughout the system. I think it's had more harmful effects in the Republican Party because the fear of being primary there, and particularly because the Republican Party moved so far to the radical right. First with the Tea Party, and then now who knows with QAnon, and where that's going to take the party. But the fear of being primary and have to toady to your voters is really destroyed. There was one end, of course, now the fear of who knows what it will be after this time next week, but also the fear of losing Trump's favor.
Right.
So that's, they will, I mean, I am a native born Cook County Democrat, so you can discount. And my dad wrote a lot about Chicago politics, so this really runs in my blood. But this fear that the worst thing that can happen to you is that you won't be reelected. There has to be some nobler sense of calling that ought to guide our political behavior. You shouldn't be in the embarrassing position of a Lindsey Graham, prostituting yourself, for the favor of Donald Trump, of all people.
Yeah, of all people, you're absolutely correct. And that leads to my next question on these same lines. The politicians today, I mean, right as we speak, what lessons could they take from the founding fathers? What if they said, what's there? What would help our politicians today? Like I said, we're just a few days away from this general election, and I share your sentiment on the Republican Party and both sides of the aisle. I mean, in my opinion, we got so much work to do after November 3rd, regardless of who is elected. I think our work just begins on November the 4th. So what lessons could we learn, politicians could learn from the founding fathers?
Yeah, the question's so open-ended. I think
it is. It's slowed down a little bit. So
to be honest,
one. If you said 1 to 1,
I think they were empirical thinkers.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I'm often because I've done a lot of work on what did the Constitution originally mean. And this one, my big book, Original Meanings, the book I won the Pulitzer for, is written on that theme. And when people ask me, it's often the case, what would James Madison think about this today?
Right.
Sometimes there was a kind of clear constitutional norm that you could say, okay, well, here you could reason pretty simply from A to B and come up with a firm conclusion. But more often, I'd say Madison was a deeply empirical thinker. He lived, he was well read and was deeply reflective about his reading. He knew Montesquieu, he knew Locke, probably knew Hobbes and Aristotle, etc. But he and his generation were engaged in a revolution, and they had to think and rethink the nature of their experience. And that's what the best historical work and I'm a part of the school that's been done on the founding period really understands that let's say the quarter century that takes you from the Stamp Act controversy, the mid-1760s, down to the adoption of the federal Constitution and the creation of the new government, was a period of intense political experimentation. That's one of the problems with saying the Constitution had an original meaning, because they understood the whole thing was the process of being created and explored, the idea that you could fix the meaning of a constitutional text at the moment of its adoption, when the whole process of implementing it was necessarily so dynamic. To a historian, that's kind of nutty. For the lawyers, it works for some somewhat strange reasons. For historians, it's a kind of nutty way to think. So I think that capacity to think critically about one's own experience, to understand its significance, which I think everybody who believes in democracy, we should believe that, this is the one, you don't have to take, Churchill's formula, the worst form of government except for any other has been invented. I think we should be morally committed to it and to the norms that we associate with it. And I think we need to be, in thinking about the founding, there's a lot to admire in what they did. Of course, these days there's a lot to criticize. I mean, many of them, including Madison, Jefferson, we're slaveholders, and we're not wholly comfortable with that embarrassing and challenging fact. But I think that capacity for self-reflection, which I personally think Madison represents, so well in such interesting ways. I mean, Hamilton's the same way. So they were deeply thoughtful, well-educated, well-informed, and they were mindful of their own experience, but in a way that was, somehow self-critical.
Stay with Madison a little bit more. How did he react when some of his propositions failed? For example, what was his? He worked so hard. He was so passionate, so well, so prepared. And when he'd make the case, and his case would just fail, how did he respond to that failure or to that defeat?
I think he took a deep breath. It took him a while to do it. If you go through his records, go through his correspondence near so the convention adjourned on September 17, 1787, 2 days before the birthday of my older grandson. He could have come out on the 17th, came out on the 19th. Anyhow, what are you going to do? At the end of the convention, Madison was actually in a pretty, I won't say gloomy, but the things he wanted most, he had lost. He didn't want the equal state vote of the Senate. He thought correctly that was a disastrous idea. He didn't want the state legislatures to elect senators. He thought there'd be a lot of problems arising from that. He wanted to give the national government what he called a negative, we would say a veto on state laws, at least to protect itself against interference from the states, maybe to intervene within the states, to protect minorities. He lost that. He had the idea for having a council provision that he thought would help to improve the quality of legislative deliberation. It would be a joint executive judicial, kind of like the president of the Supreme Court, which would have a limited negative, a limited veto over legislation. So he had all these favorite proposals that he lost. And at the end of the convention, because he was, since he worked out his own agenda in advance, he was pretty, set back, whatever, disappointed with the outcome. So there's a period of about 10 days where I think he's kind of blue. And he writes this long letter to Jefferson about a month after the October 24, 1787, so 5 weeks after the convention adjourned. He wrote a long letter to Jefferson, who was off in France, as our minister to Versailles, explaining why the idea of having a negative on state laws, which he had lost, was, in his view, I think the least possible infringement on the sovereignty of the states. That's a really strong statement. But then, there's a campaign on that has to be won. And if your choice is between, persisting, staying under the Articles of Confederation, which was usually described as an imbecile in government. Imbecile was the term often used to describe the Continental Congress in the 1780s. If that's the default position, and you think it's likely to lead to a devolution of the Union into 2 or 3 regional confederacies, and you have the Constitution out there, a lot of things you didn't get in it, but it's going to be a net improvement in significant ways. So I think that's Madison, the seasoned politician. I mean, he was so invested in his own agenda that losing it was tough. Adjusting to that defeat was tough, but there's a struggle on. And, you couldn't go back to zero. You had to kind of go. You couldn't get. You couldn't get 1.0. At least you could try to get 0.75, or whatever.
Yeah. Well, that word imbecile could be used today as well, in my opinion. A lot of things we have in our political environment. How did Madison and Jefferson become the architects of the nation's first opposition political party?
Well, it happens, begins really out of in opposition to Hamilton's financial program. I mean, It comes out of, the Hamilton, who I think was a brilliant statesman, a great architect of the nation's, economic policy. I mean, you should never undervalue Hamilton's genius.
Right.
But, they lost these fights. I personally don't think their losses were all that significant. Hamilton's program basically was a success. But they thought that Hamilton, they weren't sure Hamilton really was a committed Republican. They felt, Hamilton did, a couple famous moments. One at the Constitutional Convention, there's a famous dinner party that Jefferson hosts where they talk about the British Constitution. And Hamilton still sounds like he's a monarchist in some sense of the term, and not really committed Republican, lowercase r, but a committed Republican in principle. So they set out to organize an opposition party. My story, this is I've worked on this. In fact, I'm working on it even now in different ranks of mine. I think what really mattered though wasn't the initial disagreement over Hamilton's economic policies. Things like assuming the state debts and chartering a national bank and all that. I think what really mattered was when Britain went to war against revolutionary France in 1793, and all these issues about the control of foreign policy came into play. And then the Republicans, meaning Madison and Jefferson, they started calling themselves the Republican Party, realized that the presidency had a much larger sway in decision-making than they had originally imagined. And I think they also learned that it's a little counterintuitive for us today. But I'm going to hold on one second. I'm going to lower my shade here. But the foreign policy issues had a kind of resonance that issues about banking. I mean, who really understands banking? Even today, we have a hard time figuring out what makes it work. Who really understands how tariffs work? I mean, Donald Trump doesn't know how tariffs work.
He does.
Take an example. I mean, what an idiot.
Right.
You know, in passing,
Great.
professor remarks, but I think the foreign policy thing, the whole idea that, and of course, as the French Revolution took a turn towards, the terrorism in that sense had a somewhat different meaning from what it's acquired today, but it was still just as sinister, a threat to deal with. So I think that ratcheted the discussion up. And then you go through the different. I mean, I won't go through the details of foreign policy controversies, but I think that the key thing about it is that there was no idea in 1787, 88 that you'd have such a thing as national political parties. I mean, Madison worried about factions, but factions were more like interest groups that had particular goals in mind rather than systemic alliances to carry elections, from one cycle to the next. But very quickly, from between 1788 when the Constitution was ratified, and let's say 1792 or certainly by 1794, and party competition, a premature form, is starting to emerge. And the key thing is when Washington retires from the presidency in 1796, even though he delayed his retirement, the announcement of his retirement as long as he could, to try to, because Washington was by that time a pronounced Federalist. As soon as he announced his retirement, both parties were revved up and ready to go. And the way we know this is that all the electors, presidential electors, were already servants of their parties.
We have about 4 minutes left, and you got a new book, Beyond Belief and Beyond Conscious. Just a few minutes on that. What's that book about? So exercise of religion.
Yeah, well, the book's part of a series called Inalienable Rights that my friend and colleague Jeff Stone at the University of Chicago has edited. It's supposed to write kind of provocative books about different aspects of constitutional history with particular emphasis on rights-oriented issues. Because thinking about religious freedom was so fundamental to Madison's thinking. I mean, it was actually the first public issue to which he was deeply committed, going back to when he comes back to Virginia from his college education. I wanted to write a book I wanted to grab that topic for myself, but to write a book that would be historical in nature. Most people who write about the First Amendment today, they're mostly, particularly in the series, they're mostly constitutional lawyers, and they care a lot about doctrine. I don't care that much about doctrine, which strikes me as being kind of a mess, to be honest. But the book rests. Start by the book rests on two claims. So the subtitle of the book is the radical significance of the free exercise of religion. And the 2 points I wanted to make was to show how issues of religious freedom were integrally related to American constitutional development. So point number one is, of all the rights we claim, the one that places the greatest emphasis on our moral autonomy as individuals, on our, kind of in a sense on our individual, maybe not the best term, but on our individual sovereignty, our individual autonomy, is the free exercise of religion. The ability to say what you think, believe what you want to believe, no matter how radical the thought may be. That's a fundamental right. I mean, most other rights, when we think about them, are essentially procedural in nature. The meaning, essentially what most rights do is to say that when government acts, think about search and seizure, all the different aspects of criminal jurisprudence. When government acts, it has to conform to some fixed set of norms, right? It can't be wholly arbitrary. It can't be tyrannical. It can't say, I'm going to do what I want to do because I want to do it now. You have to have some set of standards that will reassure the citizen that, in a certain sense, that there's a broad notion of due process out there that, that the government has to comply to. The case of free exercise, we're saying government's not going to act. You alone. I mean, if you could make certain kinds of overt acts that destroy the public peace, the way, let's say, 17th century Quakers would do, or maybe sometimes, 20th century Jehovah's Witnesses or 19th century Mormons. There may be certain overt acts you do that are so destructive of social harmony that they should remain subject to jurisdiction. But the fundamental matter of belief is something government should not regulate. In the 18th century, that's a fairly radical position. To have religious dissenters out there implies, who are not subject to public scrutiny, implies a source of disorder. So that's point number one, to think about why this matters. And I think the other aspect of this is, today, if you think about issues of freedom of expression, we don't want to talk about people's religious beliefs if we can avoid doing it. We want to kind of, and we'd rather have a general free speech, particularly judges and lawyers.
Mm-hmm.
We'd rather have a general free speech doctrine under which we could subsume claims of religious truth. But historically, I think claims about the freedom of religious expression preceded claims about freedom of expression more generally. And so that's point number one. Second point is, let's think about the general American theory of constitutional government. It says that all power government exercises is delegated from the people themselves to the institutions of state, legislature, executive, judiciary, whatever. In the 18th century, you would have said the power of government was plenary in nature. There was no subject it did not reach. Right? Government could legislate about anything. There's no realm of behavior that was off the table. To remove religion from the scrutiny of government, therefore, illustrates what the idea of delegated power means. Because now you're saying an area of behavior that no society previously would have said, we're not going to bother with this. We're going to just essentially privatize this. Nobody would have said that previously. It's too dangerous. Religion is too provocative. People kill each other over it. So, of course, the state has to regulate it. But to say, no, actually, the best solution is we're going to essentially privatize it. We're going to take it off the table of public action. We're not going to have established churches. We're not going to quibble and quarrel over who gets the benefits of public support. We're going to turn all religious institutions to actually follow the reason of John Locke into voluntary associations. And Madison sees this as a great idea, which is why religion was in better shape after the revolution than it was before. So that's kind of some of the great things in the book.
I tell you what, we got to have you back. We could have this discussion for hours and hours and hours. And if I don't start doing the wrap up, I'm going to get in trouble here. It has been a pleasure. Professor, how can people reach out to you if they want to learn more about your work? You got a website?
Well, they can always email me at stanford.edu. I have a probably somewhat dated webpage. The Stanford History Department. I don't, there is no Rakove.com yet, so I don't. Maybe I should set one up.
Yeah, that would be a good one for you. That's good. So, Professor, thank you for your time. I really enjoyed it, and like I said, I research your work, and when I was working on Broken America. So, thank you for what you do, and thank you for your contribution. And hopefully, we can chat again in the future.
I'd be happy to come. I'm retired, so why not?
Okay, well, we're going to set that up. So, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Professor Jack Rakove, he's been with us for the show today. Next week, we'll be back with another session, and by the time we get back, it's going to be an election day. So please go out and vote, and wear your mask. Wear your mask. Social distance, and be safe until next week. Have a great evening.
Thank you for your participation and interest in Healing America with Dr. Jim White. To stay in touch with Jim, go to www.healingamerica